Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation regarding an overview of the 2020 census updates in FTA's Transit Award Management System, or TrAMS. My name is Mark Bathrick, FTA's Director of Grants Management and Guidance here in the Office of Transit Programs. I'm joined today by Brett Martin, who has been our lead on the implementation of the 2020 census here at FTA, as well as Epian DeShields, one of our TrAMS experts who will be helping walk us through this morning, how we'll be going through and using the 2020 census updates in TrAMS as you all work on developing your grants. Just a quick disclaimer for folks. This document and presentation does not have the force and effect of law and is not meant to bind the public in any way. The document and the presentation that we have here is intended only to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law or agency policies. Grantees and sub-grantees should refer to FTA statutes and regulations for applicable requirements. And I should also mention at the end of this slide deck, we'll have a variety of resources regarding the 2020 census, as well as TrAMS that we'll be providing for folks to help walk through some of these requirements as well. Just a quick overview of the agenda. So we've walking through our welcome and introduction of what we'll be talking about here this morning. Next, we'll have an overview of the 2020 census itself, the changes that have taken place, and the relevance to FTA and to you as the transit industry. Next, we'll walk through the urbanized area, or UZAs, as you'll hear them referred to, and the updates in TrAMS and what that means for you all as you're working on your grants. Next, we'll discuss the updates and actually show you some screenshots of what you will see in TrAMS as you navigate the various modules and those that were updated and impacted by the 2020 census. And then we'll close, as I mentioned, with some helpful resources, both in regards to the usage of TrAMS, as well as the 2020 census and what that means for you. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Brett Martin to get us started on explaining the 2020 census and what it means for FTA. Brett?
All right. Thank you, Mark, and welcome to everyone tuning into this presentation. I am Brett Martin with FTA's Office of Grants Management and Guidance, and I'm going to talk a bit about the recent 2020 census changes and their relevance to FTA programs, as well as the updates we have made in TrAMS to reflect these changes and what they may mean for you. And we'll go to the next slide and start with last December, the U.S. Census Bureau announced the results of its delineation of final urban areas based on the 2020 census. The Census Bureau developed specific criteria that define and geographically demarcate urban areas throughout the U.S., which for the latest round included such criteria as housing unit density, impervious land coverage, and commuting patterns, among others. This process occurs every 10 years to coincide with the decennial census. And one important point to note is when this happens, the geographic coverage and populations of all pre-existing urban areas that coincide with the last census change to some extent, ranging from very little to substantial, little change to substantial changes depending on the specific urban area. It is also important to note that these changes directly impact the funding distribution of and eligibility for FTA formula grant programs. We'll go to the next slide and we'll move on and cover what constitutes an urban area per the Census Bureau's definition versus what FTA uses from the Census Bureau's delineation of urban areas to inform its distribution of formula funds. Urban areas delineated by the Census Bureau must be a conglomeration with a population of at least 5,000 or 2,000 housing units, and there are thousands of census-defined urban areas in the U.S. For its formula grant programs, FTA administers its programs using a smaller subset of these urban areas, which federal transportation law defines as urbanized areas or UZAs. These are census-defined urban areas with a population of at least 50,000. For the administration of FTA formula programs, all land area in the U.S. is either within an urbanized area or it is considered rural. Between the 2010 and 2020 censuses, we went from having 497 urbanized areas to 510. And we'll go to the next slide. And what is also important for the administration of FTA's formula programs is population tiers of urbanized areas. We refer to urbanized areas with a population of at least 200,000 as large urbanized areas, and those with a population between 50,000 and one person less than 200,000 as small urbanized areas. And as I just mentioned, if you're not within an urbanized area, you are in an area that we consider rural. So why are these population tiers important? Well, recipients that are eligible to receive FTA formula funds and those that ultimately have control over that funding vary depending on the population tier. The factors that drive apportionment calculations also change from tier to tier, and program-specific rules and requirements, as well as the eligibility of public transit activities and projects that recipients may want to carry out, differ among these tiers. We'll go to the next slide. And this slide depicts the FTA formula funding distribution structure and shows who receives and has control of the formula funding we distribute by population tier. For rural areas and for small urbanized areas, funds are provided to states and territories for them to determine how they will be used and the recipients to whom they will be further distributed. So state and territorial governments really have control over this funding. For large urbanized areas, funds are provided to a locally selected designated recipient to determine how they will be used and to which other recipients they will be further distributed. So for large urbanized areas, designated recipients have control of the funding. And go to the next slide. And another important point we'd like to make about these 2020 census changes is that the next formula apportionments that will be made, which will be the fiscal year 24 apportionments, will be the first for which FTA apportions funds in accordance with the new 2020 urbanized area delineations. Apportionments you received in fiscal year 23 and prior fiscal years were apportioned in accordance with the pre-existing 2010 urbanized area delineations, and these funds are to be used in accordance with the 2010 urbanized area versus rural designations and the rules attached to the respective UZA population tiers. One way to look at this is old money and old conditions equals old rules, and new money and new conditions equals new rules. If you are in a situation where your transit service area has changed tiers. And we do not want to ignore how this impacts our discretionary programs. For these, potential recipients will apply under the new 2020 census designations for all notices of funding opportunity issued this fiscal year, and at least until we have to do all of this again in 10 years. So we'll go to the next slide. And which FTA formula programs are impacted by these changes? I'm not going to go into all of these, but just for awareness purposes, we want to note that it impacts the distribution of everything from our planning funds to our sort of all-purpose public transportation assistance funds, such as Section 5307 urbanized area and 5311 rural formula funds, to our more special purpose funds, such as our grants for buses and bus facilities and for fixed skyway and high-intensity motor bus state of good repair. And we'll go to the next slide, and let's take a look at what 2020 census impacts have relevance in TrAMS and how many cases of each type of impact we are accounting for. In the following slides, we'll go into more detail on these, but to summarize, we had 20 completely new urbanized areas created from what was previously rural area and 8 more that were at least substantially partially created from other pre-existing urbanized areas. There were 15 pre-existing urbanized areas eliminated that are either now rural or they were absorbed by another urbanized area. We had 4 small urbanized areas that previously extended into 2 states that are now located in a single state. There were 14 previously small urbanized areas that grew to be large urbanized areas, and 2 that were previously large that depopulated and or contracted in geographic coverage to become small. And we have 75 urbanized areas with name changes. With all of this being said, it is extremely important for our recipient users of TrAMS to understand that these changes are urbanized area focused and are not recipient focused, meaning these changes being made as a result of the 2020 census in TrAMS impact how TrAMS accounts for apportionments to urbanized areas and available options for place of performance for activities or projects to be carried out by recipients. It does not impact specific recipient profiles or recipient-specific details. I also want to point out that we have provided a brief summary of the changes made in TrAMS to account for these census impacts on our TrAMS webpage. And we'll go to the next slide. And what is just as important as what the changes are and what they mean is what they are not and what they do not mean. A notable caveat to these changes in TrAMS is that TrAMS does not account for all geographic changes to urbanized areas as a result of the 2020 census. It does not account for a number of urbanized area changes that have formula program distribution and eligibility implications, such as pre-existing urbanized areas that expanded to encompass previously rural area, pre-existing urbanized areas that contracted in geographic coverage, or areas in pre-existing urbanized areas that transitioned to a separate urbanized area. TrAMS is a tool that is focused on capturing the necessary accounting structure for apportionments and grant obligations, and because of that, it is not a resource that should be used to figure out what your census designation is and what it means for your FTA funding. To determine your census designation and what it means for your FTA funding, recipients should consult the FTA 2020 Census Interactive Map and Crosswalk on our 2020 Census Resources and Information webpage or consult with their regional office. Also, before diving deeper into the changes made to account for the 2020 census in TrAMS in the following slides, I'd like to mention that the concept of recipients making adjustments to account for changes in census designations in their service areas probably isn't new to our recipients. Over the summer, recipients worked through a task to adjust their National Transit Database reporting to reflect the 2020 census changes. And you will likely find that the changes we are making in TrAMS to account for the census changes align very closely in concept to the adjustments you made to your NTD reporting. All right, let's go to the next slide, and we will touch on each of the census impacts that required us to make changes in TrAMS, and we'll start with completely new urbanized areas. I'll first note that all 28 completely new urbanized areas are small urbanized areas with less than 200,000 in population. And for each of these, a new record has been created for the urbanized area to receive apportionments and for formula grant funds to be reserved and obligated against those apportionments. As I mentioned earlier, formula funds will be made available for use in these urbanized areas beginning with the fiscal year 24 apportionments. And going back to my old money and old conditions equals old rules versus new money and new conditions equals new rules concept, the only formula funds that may be reserved and obligated for use in these urbanized areas is fiscal year 24 and subsequent year funds. For these in TrAMS, you will see a new novel UZA code assigned to them that corresponds to the parent UZA and parent state UZA codes for the states or territories within which the new urbanized area extends and to the respective FTA cost center for the FTA region that covers the new urbanized area. I also want to point out that a listing of completely new urbanized areas is available on our TrAMS webpage for recipients to understand if they may or may not be impacted by this change. All right, let's go to the next slide. And the next type of change we have is pre-existing urbanized areas that have been eliminated or discontinued, or in other words, they are no longer urbanized areas. Because these were pre-existing urbanized areas that previously received formula apportionments through fiscal year 23, And as you may know, the period of availability to obligate these funds continues into fiscal year 24 and subsequent years. As a result, records for these pre-existing but now eliminated urbanized areas have been retained for further obligation of these funds that are still within their period of availability to obligate. Consequently, only pre-fiscal year 24 funds may be reserved and obligated for use in these pre-existing urbanized areas. Funds apportioned in fiscal year 24 and later will need to be reserved and obligated for use based on your new census designation. In TrAMS, these urbanized areas will be tagged as discontinued, and the TrAMS codes assigned to them will be the same as those previously assigned. And we'll go to the next slide, and we'll move on here to our next type of change. We also had 4 small urbanized areas that previously extended into 2 states that are now just located in only 1 state. And the reason this is an important point to capture is because the impacted states from which these urbanized areas receded received apportionments through fiscal year 23 for those pieces of the urbanized area that were previously in that state. And the period of availability to obligate these funds continues into fiscal year 24 and later years. So records for these portions of urbanized areas that are no longer in a state are being retained for further obligation of these funds. They will be tagged as discontinued and will retain the same coding as they had previously. And like the other similar cases I've touched on, only pre-fiscal year 24 funds may be reserved and obligated for use in these areas. Funds apportioned in fiscal 24 and later years will again need to be reserved and obligated for use based on your new census designation. And we'll go to the next slide and move on to the next type of change, which is pre-existing small urbanized areas that are now large urbanized areas. And for these, 2 separate records have been created to represent them in TrAMS. One of the records reflects or represents the urbanized area's previous codes and small urbanized area status, and the other represents or reflects new coding and it's now large urbanized area status. For the record representing the urbanized area's large urbanized area status, its codes will reflect a new parent UZA code that matches the 2020 UZA code to signify that the new large urbanized area is its own distinct parent UZA, separate from that of the state or territory where it is located. So why do we need 2 records for these? Well, going back to a previous slide on who receives apportionments and has control of them, remember the state or territory really receive and have control over small urbanized area apportionments, and locally selected designated recipients receive and have control over large urbanized area apportionments. So the coding for the previous small urbanized area status will continue to reflect the state or territory as the parent, and the coding for the large urbanized area status will reflect a designated recipient as the parent. The record representing the pre-existing small urbanized area status will remain available to track apportionments and obligations of formula funds apportioned in fiscal year 23 and prior fiscal years, and the one representing the new large urbanized area status will be used to track the same for funds apportioned in fiscal year 24 and later fiscal years. I also want to point out that both of these records will only be visible to your regional office reservationist, and recipients will only see a single record for the applicable urbanized area. However, we think it's important for our recipients to know that the 2 records exist to account for the pre-fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 24 and later year funds separately, and that your pre-fiscal year 24 funds are still available for obligation. We'll go to the next slide. And so very similar, but in reverse of what I just covered, is our cases of pre-existing large urbanized areas that are now small. 2 separate records have been created to represent these in TrAMS, with one reflecting the codes for the previous large urbanized area status and the other reflecting new coding for the new small urbanized area status that matches the parent state UZA. The record representing the pre-existing large urbanized area status remains available to track apportionments and obligations of formula funds apportioned in fiscal year 23 and prior fiscal years, and the record representing the new small urbanized area status for each will be used to track apportionments and obligations of formula funds apportioned in fiscal year 24 and later fiscal years. Similar to the small urbanized area to large urbanized area status change, both of these records will only be visible to your regional office reservationist, and recipients will only see a single record for the applicable urbanized area. And we'll go to the next slide. And our last type of change to cover is urbanized area name changes. There were 75 of these between 2010 and 2020 that resulted from changes in the principality of the places covered by the urbanized area or changes to its geographic extent, which can change the places and or states or territories engaged by the urbanized area. So in TrAMS, the new name for all urbanized areas that encountered a name change has replaced the pre-2020 census name. It is very important to point out that these urbanized area name changes do not require a separate accounting for pre-fiscal year 24 versus fiscal year 24 and later year apportionments. So accordingly, no record for the urbanized area with the previously different name is being retained separately for apportionment and obligation tracking or reservation purposes. It will simply be business as usual in the urbanized area, except the urbanized area will just have a different name than before. Okay, so that concludes my portion of the presentation, and now I'd like to turn it over to Ebony DeShields, who is also in our Office of Grants Management and Guidance, to cover what these changes will actually look like to you in TrAMS. Ebony.
Thank you, Brett. Greetings. I am Ebony DeShields with FTA's Grants Systems Division. I'll explain how the UZA updates will impact some screens and modules in TrAMS. Next slide. So first is the locations dashboard. The locations dashboard can be found on the recipient organization record. It displays the area name, UZAs, and congressional districts associated with the recipient. A new UZA code status column has been added to the right-hand side of the states and UZAs grid. It indicates whether the UZA is current as of the 2020 census or discontinued. At the bottom of the screen, there is also a message to let users know which UZAs were not carried forward. Next slide, please. Next is the recipient details and payment codes module. This can be found on the recipient organization record as well. This is where FTA users with the supervisor role can update a recipient organization's geographical information. Users impacted by the 2020 census update must coordinate with their regional representatives to have the new UZAs added. Similarly to the last screen, a new UZA code status column has been added to the geographical information grid to indicate whether the UZA is current or discontinued. There is also a message to let users know which UZAs were not carried forward. Next slide, please. The last slide is on the project locations module. Recipients see the project location screen when creating new projects. This is where they can enter information about place of performance. Again, a new UZA code status column has been added to the place of performance grid to indicate whether the UZA is current or discontinued. And again, there is also a message to let users know which UZAs were not carried forward. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Mark.
Thank you, Ebony, and thank you, Brett, as well. Appreciate the hard work that you both put in making this possible, as well as across FTA. We've had a lot of involvement from our FTA regional offices, our budget and policy office, as well as others in making this possible. So I want to make sure that we thank those folks for their involvement. Just to kind of wrap things up for us here, As mentioned, we do have a variety of resources as well for folks as you're navigating this. The first is on our TrAMS webpage, which you can see the link here on this particular screen. On this page will be this particular presentation, as well as several documents that we put together outlining what this means for you as a transit agency or as a recipient of FTA funding, as well as those areas that were specifically impacted by the 2020 census and the UZA shifts that Brett described on one of the slides there with the various iterations that took place. FTA also has a 2020 census resource webpage as well that will have this particular briefing, as well as the variety of activities that have taken place leading up to this point as we have gone ahead and implemented the 2020 census here at FTA. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening in to this presentation. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us either through your FTA Regional Office Representative or from the information listed on either of these web pages. Thank you so much, and thank you for all that you do for public transportation. With that, we'll go ahead and close the presentation. Thank you.